I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
I'm Angeli Preston.
And I'm Lorenzo Rodriguez.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We're going to have some real healing. We've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
equity, and the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side
and beyond.
The suburban area, everywhere. We must work and teach our children.
And good morning. Welcome to What's Next. On today's program, we take a look at the history of Indigenous people in the United States with Dr. Keith Burich. He's the author of We Remain: Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian. First of all, thanks for joining us, Professor Burich.
Thanks for having me.
You know, when it comes to race and racism in our current conversation, American Indians get overlooked, don't they?
Yeah, they get left out of the equation. What happened to the Native Americans is often attributed to, for example, disease. You'll read in textbooks, 95% of the Indians died from disease. Well, that's not true, but that's the prevailing assumption by scholars and historians and so on. Also, not only are they is it blamed on disease, more often than not, it's blamed on them. They're the problem. Okay. And there's no question. I've been on a lot of reservations throughout the country and over the last 25 odd years that alcohol, drugs are a persistent problem on Native Americans, and it goes back to, Benjamin Franklin one time said that that we didn't have to do anything to the Indians; they'd wipe themselves out with rum. So there are those kinds of problems. And when you go to a place like Rosebud or Pine Ridge or Crow, places that I go all the time, you see the poverty and you see the problems that inflicted on them, the troubles that are inflicted on them. And one of my students, when I took a group of students out to Rosebud for the first time, said, "Why don't they just leave?" That was a tough question to answer. and I'm not quite sure that I ever did really come up with an adequate answer. But my good friend Don Moccasin, who's on the cover of my book, said, they just want to be Indians. They don't want to leave. If they leave, they'll no longer be Indians. And so people have looked at Indians as somebody else's problem, as a problem that, is in the flyover country.
Right.
You fly over to California and you look down and there may be reservations, there may not, but who cares? It's land that's not worth living on anyway, and we'll just let them go. And so when you think about things like affirmative action, nobody thinks that it actually applies to them.
Right.
Moreover, everybody thinks that Indians are rich off casinos, which isn't true. Most Indian casinos don't make a lot of money, if anything. The one on Crow Reservation that I used to go to, where I go all the time, and they had a casino that went broke. Or they get money from the government, a lot of money from the government, which they don't. So they get everything, and they get tax breaks, and they.
Right.
So we don't think of Indians needing affirmative action.
And you just said it yourself. You've been to a lot of reservations. Kind of interested maybe if you could just help explore what it's like, because we know a little bit about the Seneca Nation. Obviously, it's local here, but you see little bits and pieces about some of these other locales around the country. Tell us a little bit about your impressions and what you've seen.
Well, the Seneca Nation is, by way of introduction, is doing quite well. I mean, they've got 3 casinos, and they've got Niagara Falls, which attracts people. I mean, they're different than, say, the Northern Cheyenne
and that's good
Montana.
news.
Yeah. I mean, which has nothing near it.
Right.
Although they do have a casino that I've gone to. But that's different than, say, Buffalo. And the Seneca have done wonderful things with their money.
Right.
People keep complaining about them, and there's kind of a contention with Kathy Hochul right now and all that stuff.
We can revisit that as we move through this conversation.
But they've done quite well, as have some other tribes around the country. But when you go to a place like Pine Ridge, Rosebud in South Dakota, Cheyenne River, all the Lakota tribes and Dakota tribes in Crow, Fort Peck, Fort Berthold, 7 different reservations in Montana, Wind River in Wyoming, you see an entirely different story. The poverty is staggering. Nobody really knows how many poor people there are. On Pine Ridge, for example, the estimate is about 54%. Some people say 90%. They live on less than half of what the average American lives on. Their unemployment is, by and large, universal. They do have jobs in some of the tribal things, agencies. They do work in some of the little mini marts and so on that you have on reservations. But by and large, there's no jobs. There's no grocery stores. What grocery stores they do have, very often the food is expired. I remember taking my students to an IGA on Crow. We were going off on one of my adventures, a buffalo hunt up in the mountains, and they were appalled because they wanted to get some things. This stuff is all expired. I said, well, welcome to the reservation.
Right.
And you know they're absent. They don't have enough medical care. The Indian Health Service does provide them with health care, and some of the hospitals are very nice. I've been in a couple of them, one in Arizona and one in Montana. I've also been to the one in Rosebud, which was so bad that a Nigerian doctor who was there working off his student loans told me he never seen anything like it, even in third world countries where he worked.
Wow.
And that was a guy I happened to bump into him in a restaurant, and we were talking about it, and he said he never saw things like that there, like he saw in Rosebud. Pine Ridge is just as bad, and so are many of the others. So it's staggering, and it's paralyzing, and as a result, there's no question that alcohol and drugs is a problem, and that is another part of the paralysis that they suffer from.
Sure.
But it goes back really.
It's generational.
Hundreds of years,
right.
Hundreds of years, back to the 18th century, when we traded with Indians. So Europeans traded with Indians in rum. Rum was the stock in trade. You gave them rum, and then they gave you deer skins, they gave you beaver pelts, and all the rest of that stuff. And ultimately, they also gave you land. There are a number of treaties that were signed under the influence.
I had a conversation recently. Tony Hiss, he actually spoke at Canisius College recently for the Land Conservancy. His focus is different. It's more on environmental issues, but he talked about some of the successful environmental trends that are coming out of Canada. And he said, one of the interesting things he said the Canadians mistreated natives. There's no doubt about that. But the one thing they didn't do, like Americans did, is they didn't kick Indians off their land.
No. Well, yes and no. I mean, they did put them on reserves.
Sure.
So like Six Nations Reserve up by Brantford is
But the point of it is, though, the reservation concept in the United States has led to the types of results that you were talking about here.
Yeah. Reservations evolved because you wanted their land, and there were going to be conflicts. Chief Justice Marshall in Johnson versus McIntosh points that out. I mean, that's where he codifies the doctrine of discovery into American law. But he also goes through a whole narrative about how Indians need to be separated from whites, that they can't live next to each other. They can't be in the same neighborhood. He uses that term, neighborhood.
Really?
Yeah. It's the part of it's in my book.
Sure,
actually.
sure.
It's a part of that decision that nobody reads because they're interested in the doctrine of discovery, and rightfully so. And he pointed that out. Well, that was true. Most Americans believe that. And what do you do with them? Well, you take away their land and put them on reserves, and you station army forts around them to make sure that they don't go off the reservation. The Army Appropriation Act of 1851 which sort of became the guideline, provided the guidelines for a reservation, said Indians could not leave their reservation without permission.
Wow.
And there was an army fort near all of them to think. If you look at a map of especially the West, and you'll see, Fort Smith, Fort Peck, Fort Berthold, Fort Hall, Fort Niobrara. Those forts were all there to keep the Indians on the reservation. And if they went off, well, that was a problem.
And I want to, I'm glad you brought up the idea about the forts, because I want to get into that in a different vein in just a little bit. But you also brought up the doctrine of discovery. We had a conversation about that previously on this program, but I think it's worth revisiting because, again, this is something that really explains a lot about, especially white people's attitudes when it comes to race. This is something that is deeply embedded in our history.
Yeah. Well, I give our listeners a brief history. The doctrine of discovery was promulgated by popes. I can't remember their exact names, but 1453 and 1493. Part of that 1493 promulgation was because of conflicts between Spain and Portugal and so on. But what it said was that basically, as the Europeans were finding out more and more about the world, including Africa and then eventually the Western Hemisphere, they were encountering non-Christian people, pagans. And, pagan is the word that Christians used for people without religion.
Right.
And they were not only pagans, but they were largely dark-skinned. And the doctrine of discovery said that basically Europeans had the right to go out and take and Christianize non-Christian lands, which meant basically the rest of the world.
Right.
And Europeans followed that. And yes, it was supposed to be for only Catholic countries, but that was all there was in the 15th century. But Queen Elizabeth adopted it for England, and they went out and exported this idea that they could conquer and exploit non-Christian lands, especially lands of dark-skinned people who had habits that repulsed Europeans.
Explore that a little bit. When you say repulse,
okay.
what you
well, they not
about
only
that.
looked different,
Sure.
they did, and they had different kinds of characteristics. But the way they dressed, they were always half naked. Yeah, they were always described as half naked. They were savages, cannibals. The term cannibals was coined at that time I don't think by Columbus, but by Spanish explorers in the Caribbean. It's derived from the word for Carib Indians. They were cannibals. They were fornicators because they engaged in sexual activities that were the church and the churches abhorred. They were heathens. They had all kinds of heathen rites and rituals and so on. Everything about them, but especially the color of their skin, set them off. And that's the essence of racism. Racism, even though race is really not a scientific concept, it's a popular construct, social construct. It's based on skin color and other kinds of characteristics, and you associate those things with certain kinds of personal behavioral characteristics. So they ate improperly. Their marriages were impermanent. They lived in scattered villages and so on. I mean, they didn't have the kind of intellectual and moral characteristics that Europeans
as Europeans judged it to be.
Judged them on. And the result is that you could do what you want with them. And that's what the doctrine of discovery basically said. They're non-Christians, they're pagans, they're heathens, they're fornicators. That's a popular term that that the priests use. And therefore, they need to be Christianized. And if they won't be Christianized, well, what do you do with them?
You force it on them.
Yeah. You force it on them, and you end up exterminating them in many cases, and that's what basically happened in the Caribbean. The most of the Caribs the Indians of the Taínos of the Caribbean were wiped out.
Wow.
And there's some left over, but basically they were wiped out. And that was used, argument was used to justify the same kind of tactics around the world. As I mentioned earlier, you never met a Tasmanian,
Right.
because the British wiped them out in 1820s. The Spanish did it in Argentina. The Belgian Germans did it in Namibia. It was the way of exporting this kind of racism around the world, and Indians in North America were the victims. And the result was a decline in population that was, horrendous, and in the end, what I would consider genocidal.
Dr. Keith Burich is with us this morning, Professor Emeritus at Canisius College, the author of We Remain, Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian. I want to just to make sure we revisit one key element of the doctrine of discovery. It has been relatively recently repudiated by the Pope.
Yes, it has.
That's a positive development, but it lingers beyond.
In America, it hasn't been. It was, as I said, it was codified into American law by Chief Justice Marshall in, I think it was 1823, but the Johnson versus McIntosh. And it's been reiterated since then, most recently by Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Now, just jumping back then a little bit, like you were talking before about Fort Smith and the forts that were set up of out west. It's also interesting to note that, like you were saying, the forts were set up near the reservations to make sure, or to help ensure, that the Indians of that particular locale didn't move on. And it's interesting to also note that these forts became such a part of the American image in the 20th century through media, whether it was TV, whether it was movies. Let's go on. Let's talk about that a little bit and how that became so ingrained.
Well, yeah, there were any number of forts, and as I said, look at a map,
Right.
and you'll see them there. Fort Defiance on Navajo, Fort Hall up in Idaho near Jackson Hole, as a matter of fact. Then Fort Smith, Fort Niobrara, you can find them all over the place. And the forts were there, and they were there to keep Indians on the reservation, or to make sure they didn't, as most Americans, go off the reservation, go on a war path. But of course, by the end of the 19th century, most Indians were on reservations, and they weren't going anywhere because the conditions were so appalling, and their population was dropping. So the forts really served to put the last of the Indians, like the Northern Cheyenne and the Lakota, after Little Bighorn battle, and Nez Perce from Idaho, back on the reservation. But by and large, they were there to keep them on the reservation and also to act as sort of police. One of the things that the reservations did that was to rob the Indians of their basic rights, but that meant stripping them of their religion, forcing the kids to go into school and to learn English and Christianity, because that was what education was all about, enforcing other kinds of rules, and the government had a whole checklist of rules that the Indians had to follow. Including they couldn't practice their own religions. You may not know this, but they couldn't practice their own religion until 1978.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, that was under Carter, and President Carter finally relieved them. Yeah, they couldn't. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't.
Right, but not to be able to do it in a public fashion.
So a lot of them are at night, because that was one way you could do it.
Right.
It was hidden in night, at night. I've been at the ceremonies that are hidden, that are conducted in the middle of the night, because that was how they learned how to do it and preserve some of their ceremonies.
You've intrigued me then. What was that like then? That sense,
was,
that shroud
a couple
of secrecy.
But the one that when I tell a story in the book about the Navajos, I was at a conference at the Navajo Community College in Saley, which is in sort of northeastern Arizona.
Okay.
And Chinle is the closest town. And the guy invited me and he said, "Why don't you come tonight and go to this ceremony?" I had no idea what it was. I had no idea where I was going. I got the rough directions, but I finally found it, and it was kind of funny that how I did. But at any rate, you got there, and it was in October, so it was cold, and that's up on the Colorado Plateau, so that's a little higher up there, a little colder. And there was a healing ceremony going on, and they had a guy in a house, a little house, and he was visited by Kachinas, as they were called. The Navajo and Hopi have these. How do I describe them? I don't know. Well, the other Kachina dolls. They're based on Kachinas. They're costumes.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess the best way to describe them, the costumes that they wear, and they come in and out. They come in and out of the residence and perform a ceremony, go back to their place, and it was amazing because this place was packed. It's cold. It's in the middle of the night. I left at 2 a.m, and lucky I don't even know how I found my way back after getting there. And there were little kids, older people in wheelchairs. There were fires to keep people warm. They had a little refreshment stand, and it was an amazing experience. I had no idea what was going on,
Right.
and I wasn't going to ask because it's none of my business. But I was amazed at how a community came together to heal one of their members in the middle of the night. In cold weather like this, little children, the elderly. And I thought to myself, this is what a community is all about. It comes together to take care of themselves. And that's what Indians are all about in many ways. That's what sovereignty means to Indians. Seneca have a word for it, or a phrase for it. We carry our own water. And that's what the Indians, the Navajo, were doing. They were taking care of their own.
It's a far different image than what we saw in movies and in TV shows.
It's different, and I've had other experiences like that, but it was one of the most moving experiences. Even though I had no idea what was going on, I had no idea where I was. I couldn't find it again if I tried. And the people were very nice to me. I was the only white guy there.
Right.
And they were very nice to me, and they sort of explained things to me. But it was just wonderful to see these people coming together to take care of themselves, and that's what, that's essential to their communities. They take care of themselves in times of peace, in times of war, in times of sickness, in times of health, and celebrations, and in mourning. I mean, they are there for each other.
Is that part of what has driven you to do this research? You're a scholar, and scholars have that, and we think of scholars with these intellectual curiosities that they have to follow. But when you were talking there about this ceremony and the community coming together, there was a certain light in your eye, and I'm wondering if that just has just fueled your passion for this a little bit more.
I am not the same person I was 25 years ago or so.
Okay.
It's changed me a great deal. And I've had students who have gone out west with me, because I did take students groups out for almost 16, 18 years, sometimes 2 or 3 a summer to various reservations. They all come back and say, this is life-changing. And it's changed me. I now understand the answer to that question, why don't they just leave? They find a joy in being Indian. And it's something we can't understand. And it's tied very much to their land, and as well as to their traditions and rituals and so on. But they just want to be Indians and to be left alone.
Like you said, it's something we can't understand. Is it something, though, that we need to respect, something that we do need to recognize?
Yeah, we have to. Because I've had people, other faculty members saying, why don't they just leave? Why
Other scholars.
Yeah, well, not necessarily, but
Okay.
but yeah, and they've said, well, why don't they want to become like us? Well, that's exactly it. They don't want to be like us. Their values are different than ours. Their way of looking at things is different than ours. I have a chapter in a book, a different way of thinking, seeing, believing. I forget the exact title, but it points out that they don't see things the same way we necessarily see things. I could give you a lot of examples of that, but my friend Don Moccasin, he saw things in nature that I never would see. Yeah, and he interpreted them differently than I would.
Can you give me that's
well,
wow,
we
that's really
were at the
fascinating.
Little Bighorn commemoration. There was a Indian monument being put up at because we always commemorated Custer, even though he was the loser.
Right.
He ended up
And the antagonist,
dead.
right?
Yeah. But we never commemorated the winners, the Indians.
Right.
And so there was a commemoration there, and I took Don and his grandma, Little Elk, and a bunch of people from Rosebud, as well as a whole bunch of students. And one of the craziest things I ever did in my life, because it was unbelievably complicated, but we got to a ceremony, and it was by the Northern Cheyenne, and they were singing and commemorating the Northern Cheyenne that had died at the Little Bighorn battle, and all of a sudden this dust devil comes in, and if you've ever been on the high plains, that's not unusual. It's high, dry, dusty, you see them. And he just nudged me and he said, "The spirits are here. They're listening to us." I said, "Oh, well, that's another way of looking at a dust devil."
Right.
He would see it. We were coming down that same trip from the Medicine Wheel in the Bighorn Mountains, which is up about 10,000 feet, and we're coming down, and there was a rainbow in the sky, and it was like a flag, not an arch, not one that arched from horizon to horizon. And he just looked at it and he said, "They heard us. Thunder clouds are the thunderers. They're coming to give us rain," and so on. I mean, they have a different way of looking at things than we do, and seeing things in nature that we would never see or understand. And I learned a lot from them, to see things, try to see things differently. Even if I couldn't be like them or understand it fully.
Right.
So
when you see a thunderstorm now, you think differently.
Oh, I think of the thunderers.
Yeah.
I remember sleeping in the Black Hills, and we were in the middle of a rainstorm. We were in a teepee, and I was laying there with my head on the ear to the ground, trying to go to sleep. And there was lightning, boom, 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 and the ground was shaking. And all of a sudden I knew what he meant by the horse nation is coming.
Wow.
It could be the buffalo, it could be the horses, but it's a different way of looking at things. Scientists have their own explanations, and I certainly respect that.
Sure.
And
But it kind of changes maybe your appreciation for the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They see spirits in everything, and it's a wonderful way of looking at the world, far different than what white people do.
Sure. And as you traveled to the different reservations and you got to know the different Native peoples, you saw the connections then? There was not they weren't necessarily universal.
No, they're not. Yeah, there
approaches,
isn't. I know people say, well, they're Native American religion, Native American philosophy. They're all different.
Yes.
And they all have their own languages, so
Sure.
their words are different
Yep.
in describing things. The Navajo have, everything in the Navajo has some sort of spiritual connection. I use the example that, there's a mountain that we crossed over. And there's a natural spring, and we stopped there to drink the water. And why is that there? Well, that's because the spirits put it there for travelers. You know, and every place on that reservation has some sort of spiritual meaning. 4 different mountains surround it. Those are all 4 rivers. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of looking at nature differently than we do. So when they see a mountain being desecrated for mining or whatever, you know, it's not just the loss of the land. It's the spiritual meaning that they associate with, spirituality associate with that particular mountain. That's why I never took kids to Mount Rushmore.
Oh.
It's a desecration. It's like spray painting a synagogue or a church. The mountain was doing quite well all by itself, you know, before they came along and decided to carve those 4 guys into it. And so I wouldn't take them because Lakota never agreed to that.
Right.
And for them, you know, the Black Hills are like their cathedral. And they get everything from it. Everything comes from the Black Hills, and they emerged there. Their emergence story is from there. They associate all kinds of things with the Black Hills, and so what do? You go and you desecrate their cathedral.
And put what could be described as 4 white imperialist images on there.
Yeah, absolutely, all of them. Not one of them liked Indians.
You know, I'm going to turn this around then a little bit. How about for you, though? It sounds, obviously, you have this book, you had another book, at least one other book that we can talk about a little bit as well. But how about, obviously, you've been able to show enough respect and to have people embrace you and take you in, because that's not always the case, right? And understandably so.
They are. I was warned by some of my friends here, Native friends here, that there's the close communities. And so it's not very easy, I would say. But I'll tell you a story that I tell in the book at the beginning, because it's probably the most important thing I learned, because I had to unlearn everything. And so now I'm starting my education again. I was looking for a place to take students. I thought I had one in Navajo. It didn't work out. I go to a meeting and somebody says, well, talk to this guy over at the Oglala Community College on Pine Ridge. And I said to him, I called him, and he was very nice. And I said, I want to bring students out to Pine Ridge or there. He said, you don't want to come here and paint things and clean things up and fix things up. And I said, no, I want a cultural immersion program for them in the summer. And he said, good, you people have helped us enough. That was a shot across my bow, but it was from that point I realized they're different than we are.
Right.
And different than I am. And I have to respect and learn to see them from see things from their perspective, try to understand it. I can't be an Indian. I'm not a wannabe. I've known a lot of wannabes, and I've seen them in action, and they're troubling because they try to copy things, native things, and they do it all wrong. They'll learn languages and they'll mispronounce things. They almost comical in many respects. So I'm not a wannabe, but I learned to see things from their perspective. And that was the first time when I really realized that I had to unlearn everything that I ever knew. And so by doing that, I think I've gotten their respect and trust. And from the Seneca and the Tuscarora all the way out to the Crow and everywhere in between, just about, I've been able to make friends and learn from them. They have a lot to teach us.
Right. I think that's worth talking about that, because we talk about the environment is such a key part of most discussions. I would say political, philosophical, societal, global discussions for sure. But the Native Americans, they have a template that I think in many ways could be a way of moving forward.
Yeah. Well, for them, land is everything. I mean, it's where, I like to put it this way. I don't know whether they would necessarily agree,
Sure.
but the way I've always explained, I try to explain it in class. Their culture is organic; it grows out of the land. If you look at the Lakota and Plains Indians in general, the Pawnee and Cheyenne, they live in teepees. Now, we always wanted to get them out of teepees and into log homes, and many of the treaties required that.
Wow.
And paid them to do that sort of thing. And we say, but teepees, how do you live in a teepee? And what about snowstorms and all sorts of things like that? Well, the fact is that the teepees are like, I like to think of them as the modern day or the old-fashioned RVs. Recreation. Well, you camp in a place, you take advantage of the whatever resources, water, for example, especially on the high plains. You got to always, or you're looking for buffalo or whatever, and things get fouled because you have a thing. You move, and you leave the land the way it was, and that's true for that. Teepees, which are actually quite comfortable. I just think
Okay.
I've stayed and put up a number of them. I don't know if I've ever been in one in the middle of winter.
Right.
But I have been in cold weather. At any rate, but Indians here too in the East did the same kinds of things. They moved seasonally, and that drove settlers crazy. Why are they moving all the time? Well, they moved to one hunting ground in the winter and in the fall, planting grounds in the summer, and so on. This area gets used up because of the timber. We've used the timber. We'll let it grow back, and move to another area. That's their way of looking at land. It's to be used, but not owned. And there's when you go into national parks, you're just going to leave. What's the how does it go? I can't think. Take with you whatever you brought in. Right? Well, that's what their idea is. Leave it the way it was.
Right.
And they move around, and it drove people crazy, and that's why you put them on reservations. And that's one of the things that created the most problems for them, because all of a sudden now they're sedentary. There are any number of things that came into play as a result of that. Diseases, reservations didn't have adequate water, toilet facilities, and so on. They stayed in one place, and as a result, their diets were terrible. They had to change their diets to the rations provided by the agency rather than pursuing the kinds of food that they did normally. And the result of it is the populations continued to decline even after the wars were over. And part of that is because they were put on reservations made to sit still. And as a result, even today, alcohol and drugs create problems for them still to this day because of that tradition of taking away their right to move. And that was the law. They weren't allowed to go anywhere.
Dr. Keith Burich is our guest this morning. His most recent book, We Remain, Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian. We touched on this, I think, before we went on the air, so I want to make sure that we get to this because I've kind of vaulted us into the reservation world here a little bit and kind of bypassed a lot of the history that went into this, obviously, and there's a lot to know. But you were telling me, you were giving me numbers about the number of Indians that were in the United States or in America, what would become the United States,
right.
North America, and how that population dwindled, and many have brushed that off as simply
Disease.
a product of disease.
Yeah.
But that is not the case.
No, it's not. You shouldn't write off diseases. They killed a lot of Americans.
Sure.
The smallpox epidemic ripped through North America and killed whites and Indians in the 1770s during the Revolution. George Washington's troops at Valley Forge got it. So disease is important, but smallpox doesn't kill everybody, and nor do other diseases. And so you can't say that disease is the problem. There were varying numbers here before the Europeans came, before Columbus, before the settlements in North America. 10, 12, 15 million. I always sort of split the difference and say around 12 million.
Okay.
So about 1,500, 12 million. By 1890, 1900, the census, I said 1890 before, it may have been 1900 census, but there were 247,000 left.
Wow.
And you can't blame that all on disease. Slavery, the enslavement of Indians from the very beginning. They were the first to be enslaved and shipped off to the Caribbean. And as I mentioned to you in earlier, Bermuda. There's still a colony of the descendants of Indian slaves in one of the islands in Bermuda. Slavery. But the other issue is even with slavery, the slave raids that were used to capture slaves decimated their population in so many different ways, took away their shelter, their food, and since women and children were the prize slaves, that ultimately is going to affect our fertility. And one of the things I bring out in my book is that fertility rates dropped. And in some cases, tribes would have to be absorbed by other tribes because they wouldn't have enough genetic variability, diversity to reproduce. If your numbers drop and everybody's related, you can't have children. They knew that, and so some tribes that were around, there were hundreds. There's still 800 out there, 500 and some recognized and 200 and some not recognized, but there were more than that, and they disappeared or were absorbed by other tribes. To me, the real issue is the total warfare that began almost immediately in 1500.
When the explorers were coming.
When the explorers came. Well, the traders, traders would come along, coasters as they were called. They would trade, and they would legitimate trade. Furs, deer skins were the real stock in trade. That's where the term buck comes from.
Okay.
Buckskin was an important commodity.
Right.
And they did that. And then, of course, they also introduced rum, which was the other stock in trade. But they also engaged in slave trading. Columbus took slaves back with him after his first trip. That set the pattern for the kinds of raids and assaults on Indian villages and communities for the next 400 years or so. The last, and people don't believe this, but the last Indian massacre of any sort was in 1923. That's 100 years ago.
Wow.
I know. People don't believe that when I tell them that because they think that, the Indian wars were the Indians went on the warpath. They attacked settlers and wagon trains and all the rest of that stuff. And the cavalry came to the rescue. But as I mentioned earlier, the Indians had to be protected from the cavalry.
Right.
And that was the case. And so there were. It was a combination of things. Disease, certainly. I don't try to dismiss that. Disease, warfare, starvation, lack of shelter. When the cavalry attacked Indian villages, they destroyed everything. Horses, dogs, meat stored up, any other kinds of stores that they had, and their shelters. Well, what happens if you're in North Dakota and General Sully comes after you at Whitestone Hill, or is that South Dakota? Well, one way or another.
The Dakotas.
I get those mixed up. And there's only one Dakota at that time. That's right. So and he wipes out tens of thousands of pounds of buffalo meat that they had accumulated, and their horses and dogs, literally, they went out, hunted down survivors, and left the ones that could escape barely with what they sort of had on their backs, literally.
Right.
We're talking about being left to being exposed in a North Dakota winter. So,
and you also mentioned before we went on the air, so we had a great conversation before we went on the air, but also the idea that Indian slaves, overlooked in a lot of ways, but were very much in existence in California.
yes,
Which was came in as a free state.
in 1850, right? It did. That was part of the Compromise of 1850. It came in as a free state, but Indians were continued to be enslaved, and finally they ended it, I think, legally in 1867 or something like that, after the Civil War. But in point of fact, and the studies have shown that they were kept in slavery, in what was known as debt peonage. You know, you owed money, therefore you couldn't do anything, you couldn't go anywhere, and until really the 20th century. I don't know whether that's true or not, but yeah, California was. There's a book called The Murder State. It's about the way Californians treated Indians. It was, horrendous kinds of things that were done to them. The Spaniards, by the way, started it, so it's not just Americans.
Sure. Well, yeah, right.
And the Mexicans too, because they took over from Spain. But once we discovered gold, then it was Americans, and they really decimated the native population. Any number of massacres. The number of wars that there were out there, they had all kinds of names. I list them in my book, but they had one war after another against Indians, and the victims were either killed or enslaved.
You mentioned a book there just now. We'll mention yours again. We Remain: Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian by Dr. Keith Burich. There's a way to get started to know a little bit more about the history of, we'll call it, U.S. Indian relations. But how would you suggest? And you had students for many years that you probably found ways of engaging them, bringing them into a better understanding of things. Our listeners now are your students, Dr. Burich.
Oh boy!
Take us into that. How would you advise or encourage people to try to take those steps to a better understanding of what this is really all about?
Well, there are a number of ways, but one is to do reading, not just my book, but there are plenty of books out there that when I first started this back in the 1990s, there was nothing. All the books were outdated and inaccurate. Today there are plenty of books that are available. In Buffalo, you're kind of blessed. You have 4 different reservations, and they all have ceremonies. And I just last weekend I was at the powwow at Salamanca.
Okay.
If you want to understand the fact that Indians aren't going anywhere,
Right.
and they're very happy to be Indians, and they very proud of it, and find, like I said, they find a joy in being Indian. Go to a powwow.
Okay.
Especially the little kids, the tiny tots they're called, and there's a grand entry at the beginning of the powwow where all the dancers come in, and they're by different groups, but at the end is generally the tiny tots. And if you want to see that the Indians are still here and aren't going anywhere, take a look at those little kids. They are delights. First of all, they're cuter than heck, but secondly, their outfits and so on, and they're trying to emulate their parents. They're doing all sorts of things, and it's just wonderful to see. And there's something called the commemoration or the remembrance of the Kinsua Dam down in Salamanca, when the Allegheny River was dammed up and flooded all of the Seneca lands. That's going on. There are things on reservations that are open to the public that people can find out, and they're all online. It's one of the great things. You may not like the social media necessarily all that much, but that's one good thing, one good side of it, and so you can learn from them. Yeah.
I actually was out, as you were talking about that, it reminded me I was invited and graciously accepted an invitation to the Tonawanda Seneca
Right.
reservation or nation near Akron last year, and for their history association held an annual event, and I got to have corn soup, which was surprisingly tremendous. It was just great to enjoy something, and that's again the idea that these are traditions that are incredibly old.
Yes, and they're willing to share them with you.
Right.
They want you to know their story, and they want to tell it themselves. That's one of the things I did. Like I said, I had to unlearn everything I knew, but I also had to learn.
Right.
And I had I lucked out. I just met people, and Jackie Labonte from Six Stations is a Mohawk up in Canada, and she introduced me to people and took me to different kinds of ceremonies. And so when I started doing this, I said, I can't really teach this by myself. I have to bring in Indians. So I used to bring in. I had speakers from Canada, from South Dakota, from Pennsylvania, from all over who came, and I'd sometimes get 200 people I held them at night, and I'd get 200 people on campus to hear these things. One time we had a big ceremony. We were dancing and. In the old church, St. Vincent's Church up there, we were dancing all through the aisles and everything. I had some wonderful things, and that was one of the things I learned, was that you have to learn from them.
Right.
And they came, and they were more than willing to share and to teach us. And when you asked about when I go out to reservations, how I've been received. Every time I took groups out to any reservation, people were more than willing to help and to talk and to teach. They are closed communities in a certain sense, but they're more than willing to help understand what their history and their culture. And I think they are some of the most generous people I've ever met in my life. And they've got nothing to give in many cases, but they're generous too. I tell a story about giveaways, which were outlawed, by the way.
Giveaways are outlawed.
Yeah. What you have is a ceremony. It's your birthday. Well, we're all used to getting gifts for our birthday, right? Not them. They give gifts. And you go to giveaways, and some of the big giveaways which were outlawed because the government thought, well, that prevents them from accumulating wealth because they give everything away. A person dies, they have a giveaway, so they give away his stuff. Well, at one point, one of the first ones I ever went to was on Rosebud at St. Francis, and they came around and they had shopping baskets full of stuff. And you're supposed to take something, and we ended up with all kinds of stuff which we couldn't bring back on the airplane. so we had to find a way of getting rid of it. You can't say no. You have to accept it.
You have to have your own giveaway.
But one of the things that I got was toilet paper.
Oh.
That's the title of one of my chapters in the book, is toilet paper. And I sort of chuckled to myself. And then I started thinking, for these people, toilet paper is a luxury in many cases. There are no stores. It's hard to get. It costs money. It's an essential. Just think about what happened at the beginning of COVID when everybody thought they were going to be out of toilet paper.
Right.
There were runs on toilet paper, and including me. I was running to Wegmans to get the toilet paper for our family. It's an essential commodity, but they didn't necessarily have it. And I thought, boy, that's great that they're doing this, but they're giving away all of these things to you. And toilet paper may not seem like that important, but it is. And they give you towels and other kinds of things that you might need, necessities that you'd have to spend money for, and people give them away. And they'll save up a year accumulating things to give away at their name. Of course, it's one way of impressing people,
Right.
The more you give away, the more impressive you are. But
Sure.
it's the point is that they are generous.
Wow.
Give away everything. And like I said, the government tried to stop it and did have laws against giveaways on reservations.
I think that might be a great place to end our conversation, because I think that the government was against generosity.
Yes.
Dr. Burich's book is called We Remain: Race, Racism, and the Story of the American Indian. You've been listening to What's Next on WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station.